I call the Honourable David Seymour.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I got to say, if you ever wondered why the Green Party needs to have two leaders, that speech by Marama Davidson was all the evidence that you'd ever need. Mr Speaker, it felt like it was written by an ad agency, but at the end of it, no one had a clue what they're actually selling. Platitude after platitude, and that's why they're over there, and I hope that they stay over there for the sake of New Zealand for a very, very long time. But, Mr Speaker, turning to you, I want to congratulate you again for your election after a long and winding road to today, where you are our Speaker, and we think you're going to do a very good job. To the other leaders of political parties who have been elected again, to the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins, to Chris Luxon, Prime Minister, along with Nicola Willis, and to the Right Honourable Winston Peters and Shane Jones, congratulations on the results. To Rawiri Waititi, Debbie Naruapaka, congratulations on leading your parties back to this place in Parliament. To all of those people who are new to Parliament, it is a wonderful institution, and it is whatever you make it. You are given enormous privileges to speak freely and debate, but you are given those privileges by the people of New Zealand to do your best for them. And I look forward to hearing the maiden statements, as we've heard two excellent statements this afternoon. I look forward to hearing as many as I can of what new members are bringing to this House to use those privileges for the betterment of those who have given them to them. I particularly want to acknowledge ACT MPs. The six of us returning, Nicole McKee, now a Minister, Associate Minister of Justice and of Courts, is going to fix so much of what has been done wrong in firearms law in particular, but is also going to be a formidable opponent of crime in her role, making the courts work better and faster for all those people who seek justice in our country. To Karen Chua, who completes an extraordinary journey from a victim of mistreatment at the hands of SIPs, then SIFs, then Oranga Tamariki, to be the Minister of Children in charge with the capacity to do something about it. To Mark Cameron, our farmer MP, to Simon Court, the only person I know who has applied for complex RMA consents in this Parliament, now in a position to make them a little bit less complex for the people trying to build this country. And to our new MPs, to Todd Stevenson, the pocket rocket, straight from corporate Australia and fitting in just perfectly in the parliamentary environment. We welcome him, and a strong presence for ACT in the lower South Island. To Andrew Hogarth, they say if he walks like a farmer, if he talks like a farmer, guess what? And he's going to be a fantastic Minister of Biosecurity, Food Safety, Associate Agriculture. It's fantastic that those people in rural New Zealand across the three parties of government have such strong and experienced advocates where they have been neglected for so long. Paramjit Parmar coming back to Parliament with a new plane strip. And I'm really pleased to have her as an experienced member and one of the most qualified people to be in this Parliament, perhaps in decades, with her deep knowledge of science along with her business and broadcasting and political background. Laura Trask, someone who runs a business, something we haven't heard on the government side of this House for quite some time. But Laura Trask is someone who runs a business, as does Cameron Luxon, a builder. And Cameron Luxon, I think it's probably true, built more houses personally than the government built in the 6 years that it had. These are the ACT team that I want to congratulate. But in case you think I've forgotten, last but most certainly not least, Brooke van Velden, my good friend, my deputy, now the MP for Tamaki, who has just had a whole electorate of people see what we have seen in Brooke for such a long time. And I might add, I think Richard Wagstaff's seen a new side of her in the last 48 hours too. I just say, if you're going to go on camera and lie about your interactions with Brooke, you probably won't be doing it again. Brooke is a formidable politician, a formidable intellect, and someone with an enormous future that is going to bring about tremendous change in her ministerial portfolios. And I believe, and I haven't researched this, but from memory, I saw Simon Upton over there before. I believe that Brooke may be the youngest cabinet minister in the history of our country, certainly in any memory that I have. Paul Goldsmith, this is why you don't have a historian next door, he says Phil Goff. But there you go, she's going to be the best and youngest. I also want to thank those many people outside Parliament who have made possible what just happened. Another peaceful transition of power, a contest of ideas, a battle of words rather than weapons. There are so many countries where so many people are literally fighting to have the things that we in New Zealand so easily take for granted. And it's often the people who take the practical steps to make it happen. Ex-volunteers, and we seem to have appealed to practical people, put up more pink signs in some parts of the country, that we actually got safety complaints from the local authorities because there was more pink than road signs in large parts of New Zealand's highway network. It's those people that came to street corner meetings, who came to town hall meetings. And I've just heard Rawiri Waititi say, oh, that's what money will do. Well, let me tell Rawiri Waititi, a skin for a billboard or a hoarding costs about $30. It's the volunteer labour of the people that got out and did that. But you wouldn't ask Rawiri Waititi if you wanted to know about hard work, would you? Mr. Speaker, we also saw people who attended town hall meetings, who came to street corner meetings. We had people who argued with their colleagues and their family and persuaded, eventually, 250,000 New Zealanders to trust X with their party vote. Beyond those in the Epsom electorate, who I am incredibly grateful to thank for sending me to this place for a fourth time. It is humbling to be elected by your neighbours, to speak on their behalf, and what wonderful neighbourhoods they are in the electorate of Epsom. I also want to thank the ex-party board. They are the head of a great membership of volunteers, activists, donors, all of those people that give up their time for nothing but the feeling that they have made our democracy possible. Nobody forces any of them to do it. Almost none of them are paid a cent, and yet they show up every 3 years and make our democracy possible. There's also many candidates from all parties who gave it their all and were not returned to Parliament. That is the reality of any contest. But I want to say to them that if you missed out this time, it may be that next time is your time, or the time after that. Some people stand many times and go on to have tremendous parliamentary careers, but your efforts have been noticed and they will contribute to whatever you want to do in a future election. And Mr. Speaker, I think the reason that so many people came out and were prepared to work so hard towards ensuring this government changed is that, well, frankly, they were motivated by the Labor government and its allies and its potential allies who made such a hash of New Zealand. And if you look at just the raw numbers, Grant Robertson, somebody who, as Finance Minister, was reduced to trying to explain why perhaps a boondoggle might actually be a good thing. I mean, it was hard to believe today, but that actually happened. You had a Minister of Finance saying, oh no, boondoggles could be good. Here's the dictionary definition, and if I can contort myself enough, I might even convince myself. That is Grant Robertson's legacy. But it's also, by the plain numbers, this. Grant Robertson, as Minister of Finance, had the job of ensuring that the taxpayer's dollar went as far as possible to deliver the services and alleviate the suffering of New Zealanders in a range of areas. And the bottom line is that from 2017 to this year, he increased the amount government spends above inflation above population growth. You know, there's no jiggery-pokery here. Per person, after inflation, he increased expenditure by 30%. And New Zealand taxpayers need to ask themselves, am I getting 30% better real service from government? In which area might they look for it? They might look in education. Chris Hipkins, it was kind of interesting today. It's almost like he has the most wonderful form of selective amnesia. I listened to him and I couldn't think, I thought this can't be the same guy who is predominantly responsible for the state of education today. But he was the Minister of Education for 5 years. He was responsible for Tupukenga. And the challenge for this government laid down today could not be starker. The PISA examinations of 15-year-olds in science, literacy and mathematics have been tested every 3 years since the turn of the century. And we have just had the worst results ever for New Zealand. The damage that has been done over the past 2 decades will take another generation to fully turn around. And yet, we had not 2,500 bureaucrats in the Ministry of Education, but 4,400. That's the growth under Labor, and our results got worse. Our school attendance got worse. So Grant Robertson and Chris Hipkins, thick as thieves, in fact, taxpayers might say that's exactly what they were conniving together to get fewer kids going to school, learning less for more money. That's the big problem. Productivity right across the economy was in the tank. You might have thought that all these schemes they had to invest in this and invest in that would somehow make New Zealand more productive. The truth is that if Labor MPs knew how to invest capital, they wouldn't be Labor MPs. They'd be rich. The reality is they had no idea how to transform an economy, but they inadvertently transformed it to have some of the highest inflation in living memory. I think Grant Robertson, and possible exception, no offence, Adrian Ruafair, were probably the only people in that Labor government old enough to remember the last time inflation had been as bad as they left it. But that is one of the outcomes of Grant Robertson's unproductive spending spree. But perhaps more than anything, the previous government was elected to solve the problem of housing. It's one of the biggest drivers of the cost of living crisis, one of the biggest drivers of poverty and one of the biggest drivers in crime, and educational underattainment, people getting moved as students from uncle to auntie from one term to the next and never settling in one school. The Labor government was elected more than anything to solve the shortage of housing and build more homes. And how'd it go? Well, Kiwi Build was so politically and policy-wise disastrous that it almost became unfair to raise it in politics. I mean, it was so bad you sort of thought, oh, come on, go easy on them. Their RMA reforms managed to make the resource management law more complicated, but with novel terms such as te oranga o te taiao, which would need to be interpreted in new jurisprudence by the Environment Court, by which time we would probably be economically overtaken by Indonesia. And yet that was the Labor Party's idea of how to get more houses built. Mr. Speaker, in just about every area, we found a Labor Party that spent more money, made more rules and got worse results. And I think I'd have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, they returned today so run down and clapped out that if this Labor Party was a used car, it would be illegal to import them to New Zealand. They just don't go anymore. And they also hate cars anyway, the Minister of Transport tells us. It's an excellent point. Mr. Speaker, I raise all of this because we heard from Chris Hipkins a couple of things in his speech. He said that the government doesn't have a vision. It just wants to delete so much of what the previous government has done. And that second part is true. Three Waters we do want to cancel. Te Pukenga was a disaster under Chris Hipkins' watch that does need to be unravelled. Fair pay agreements, so-called, will be gone by Brooke van Velden, no matter how eager and quickly the CTU are to find out about it. Mr Speaker, the reason that we want to get rid of these damaging policies like the Natural and Built Environments Act and the Spatial Planning Act is that Labor's vision was one of central control, centralised politics, centralised healthcare, centralised three waters, give the Minister for the Environment more power over what is built in your street. And that is certainly a vision in Labour and perhaps the Greens and Te Pāti Māori's eyes, because their vision is about politicians doing things. It's not that we don't have a vision, it's just that we have a different vision from the point of view of the New Zealanders who have to live in this country and are trying to make a difference in their own lives and the lives of those that they care about. And that's why this government will be strongly committed, more committed than any government in history, to dealing to the red tape and regulation that wastes people's time going through compliance activities that add nothing to the public welfare but dramatically impoverish people and eventually all of us in their private welfare. If we want to raise productivity, we must spend more time producing and less time complying with rules that don't make sense. And I'm proud to be the first Minister of Regulation with a Ministry of Regulation and a regulatory standards bill setting out the principles of how you make laws that do make sense and then go through the enormous stock of out-of-date rules and regulations that waste our time and money. That, Mr Speaker, is what I call a vision, but it's a vision of empowerment for ordinary people, not a vision of meddling for the few politicians and the not-so-few bureaucrats that Labor hired. Mr Speaker, our vision is that people get to spend more of their own money. You see, as I mentioned, the Labor Party spent like drunken sailors and were about as effective at getting useful things done. Mr Speaker, the previous Labor government has given us a massive fiscal headache, and sadly that is pain that in different ways will be shared by all New Zealanders. But I have great confidence in Nicola Willis, along with Chris Bishop and Shane Jones and myself as Associate Finance Ministers, to get this ship back on course. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to see that 2017 baselines for the number of public servants will be a starting point for getting costs under control, because you don't just have to pay these people, they then get bored and make you jump through extra hoops, which further damages our productivity. And just as that could be a lose-lose, removing unnecessary expenditure and activity is a win-win, and that's a vision for everyday New Zealanders. Mr Speaker, when it comes to crime, it is time to call time on the experiment of Labor. That is, if only we are kind to criminals, they'll be kind back. Now, I can understand, I like to be kind too, but it's a little bit harder when you meet the victims. When you go to liquor stores, when you go to dairies, when you go to retailers, when you talk to store owners who keep a boutique fashion place that they're afraid to lock up at 6 o'clock in winter because it's dark then and they don't know who's going to be around, and they heard what happened to one of their colleagues in the alley just a few weeks back, something the police are still investigating. I'm sorry, Mr Speaker, but these stories are real, and they're not from some place where people think there's a lot of crime. They're from places where people would otherwise think there wasn't a lot of crime in central Auckland. Mr Speaker, this government is going to increase prison capacity. This government is going to give the courts and the police options for young offenders. This government is going to make sure that if you attack someone in a sole charge workplace or a workplace attached to their dwelling house, then that's an aggravating factor. Or if you're a member of a gang, you're going away for longer, because being kind to crims hasn't worked. It's time to put them back in their place, and that is behind bars. Mr Speaker, we talked about education, and I think we have an excellent education minister and an excellent commitment to shift the way that education policy is done. You see, Mr Speaker, for far too long, We have had an education policy that is driven by a burgeoning ministry that meddles endlessly in the inputs. They'll tell you how to teach, they'll tell you what shape the classroom should be. Hint, it's 3 classrooms joined together with lots of beanbags. They'll tell you what to teach. Hint, it's usually politically motivated. But they don't actually ask the hard questions like, how many kids showed up to school yesterday? How many of them passing? How many of them prepared for the modern workplace to be citizens in the most knowledge-rich century that humans will ever exist in? Well, this government is going to flip that switch. We're going to empower educators to actually be in charge of their schools with their cell phones safely away, and then demand that the kids show up and the results are achieved. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party said that there isn't a lot of vision. Well, I can tell the Labor Party that I know a few parents, and I know a few kids, and actually the vision of being enabled to navigate the 21st century with the basic skills that these guys neglected, that's a vision. And if only we'd had that vision 6 years ago and started earlier, there'd be far fewer kids who have been sent out into the world cruelly without the basic skills to navigate that world. And the purest version of demanding results and giving flexibility and empowerment to educators is partnership schools, kura-horua, colloquially known as charter schools, that will be back and better and bigger than ever. Teacher unions, you can hear that. Mr Speaker, we have an excellent Minister of Health, not only because he's a doctor, he's also a seriously passionate and good guy. And we are going to see a healthcare system that is not focused on the vision of reorganising the wiring diagram in Wellington, but instead a Ministry of Health and a health system that treats all New Zealanders equally based on need using good data, not lazy and bigoted discrimination based on race, and that focuses on ensuring the patients are getting the results, not the administrators are happy or that the health system is doing right by identity politics. We're also going to see Pharmac dragged into the modern age with an attitude that is friendly to those people going through difficult times and in need of pharmaceuticals so that they can get by, and we're going to see their funding model reflect the impacts of funding on the rest of the government's books. In immigration, we're a nation of immigrants. We're going to lift the cap on recognised seasonal employers so we don't have the constant interjurisdictional fights over who has quota to have people to get the work done. We're going to redeem a promissory note made to thousands, in fact hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders, that this is a country that wants you, and if you come here and if you cover their costs, you can bring your parents. Mr Speaker, I was speaking to a woman not so long ago who was a prominent person at a major university. In fact, it probably doesn't harm to say that she was running a department. And she said, look, my mother, I'm an only child, my mother is in the United Kingdom. If I can't get her here, I'm going home. And I know that'll have an impact on my career, it'll have an impact on the university, it'll have an impact on my students. Well, this government says that if she's prepared to pay the costs of the healthcare, and if she's prepared to guarantee there'll be no cost on the state, her mum can have a 5-year visitor visa to come in and out of New Zealand as much as she likes and be in this country. And doesn't that restore the faith that New Zealanders, new New Zealanders who have come from all over the world, put in this country? That is our objective, Mr Speaker. And there's another group of people who have been a bit marginalised. There are people who own a house and let another New Zealander live in it in return for money. Now, I would have said that was a beautiful example of human cooperation. But the Labor Party and allies have been so myopic that they thought the way to help the people living in the house was to attack the people that own the house. I think their philosophy was the beatings will continue until morale improves. Well, plot twist, Mr Speaker. Morale did not improve. People pulled back from being landlords, and tenants were the ones that suffered with record increases in rent over the 6 years that we've just seen with this government. Well, Mr Speaker, we're going to say if it's your house and you want to evict someone, you can. That's just how property works, but it has the enormous advantage that it makes people more willing to let someone else live in a house they own in the first place, and especially someone that they may have some questions or causes for concern about. Mr Speaker, that to me sounds like the civilised way to go about doing business in New Zealand, and it's actually going to help the most disadvantaged tenants when we have no-fault evictions. It's also going to help landlords enormously when the amount of mortgage interest that they can deduct from their tax bill is increased more rapidly than any other party had promised, and that is an enormous benefit not only to landlords but also to tenants because they go together. And there's another group of New Zealanders, Mr Speaker, who have been neglected for reasons I struggle to fathom. Those who go out of their way to give food to other New Zealanders, and about 8 times as many people who are our export customers overseas. And yet we've seen rural New Zealand, the likes of Andrew Hoggard and Mark Cameron, beaten around the ears as public enemy number 1 for year after year for having the temerity to use the land to produce food, to employ people and try and feed the world and earn export receipts. Well, they now have a government that actually has some farmers, that actually respects farmers, and that is going to get rid of the NPS Freshwater 2020 and replace it with something sensible that actually has regard to local conditions. We're going to stop putting SNAs where some pimply teenager out of planning school looks at your farm on Google Earth and says, that looks like a bit of biodiversity, you can't have that anymore. Because if you do that, people won't want to do conservation because the pimply teenagers at the local council will take your property rights. So no more SNAs. We're going to have a split gas approach to methane and other greenhouse gases because, Mr Speaker, we actually do follow the science, and the science says that methane has different characteristics from CO2. Now, you're not going to get that from the Green Party, who have not elected an MP who studied science past high school in 12 years. The ACT Party has more scientists than the Green Party has elected probably in its history, but I will watch the maiden statements to see if any of you guys have actually studied science, because if you have, you'll be the first Green MP that's done that for a very, very long time. Mr Speaker, there's another group of people, licensed firearm owners, scapegoated, punished and pushed beyond reason by this previous government. They were almost blamed for our nation's tragedy in Christchurch. The government pushed hundreds of thousands of what they deemed the most dangerous firearms into the grey and black market in what may have been one of the stupidest, most irresponsible policies that any government has rushed through this parliament. But, Mr Speaker, Nicole McKee, for 25 years a firearms safety officer, it's difficult to think of a better person to be in charge of firearms law now. I feel much safer already, and we're going to see clubs and ranges have the most egregious regulations gone. We're going to see a new Arms Act, and we're going to ask a very basic question you should ask about any policy. Is this firearms registry actually making us safer? Because there's a good school of thought that it's not. Mr Speaker, in housing, we're going to see the Resource Management Act gone and replaced with a law based on property rights. And speaking of property rights, the medium density residential standard, a folly that invaded the peaceful enjoyment of so many people's property or wood, will become optional with councils required to re-ratify it. Mr Speaker, we are going to see a constructive debate about what the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi mean. And people will get into enormous hysterics about this because, you know, some people aren't what you'd call intellectual. And those people who aren't so intellectual, they tend to be afraid of debate. And so they will call you racist and they'll shout you down and they'll try and block the motorway. But those of us who do enjoy the contest of ideas are looking forward to having a discussion about what those principles mean what those principles mean, what the lens through which we view the treaty from 2023 actually means. And I suspect if they do their study and if they read and they take the time, and some of those people shouting in the background might actually enjoy the discussion and find that it is mana enhancing for Te Tiriti and Māoridom, but I'm not sure that they're up to it. The challenge, the widow, is now laid down for them. Mr. Speaker, this government has a vision of empowerment, a vision of New Zealanders as people who are treated alike in dignity regardless of their identity, who have the ability to make a difference in their own lives and the lives of those that they care about. And with that vision, we are all going to be wealthier and happier for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.